The conversation around ADHD often lingers in the past, focusing on childhood behaviors and school struggles. But what happens when these kids grow up? The need for support doesn't just disappear, yet many adults are left navigating work and life without the right tools to succeed. In this episode, I sit down with Christal Wang, founder of Shimmer ADHD Coaching, and we're going to talk about what's missing in ADHD support today. From challenging outdated narratives to offering practical strategies, this discussion rethinks what it truly means to support neurodistinct minds. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. All right, so hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Think Differently. Today, we're going to dive into a question that many people have asked me, and the question is there a better way to support people with ADHD? And so whether you're diagnosed with ADHD, you know someone who has, or you're just simply curious, the challenges people face in finding meaningful support are often frustrating and complex. And it's not just about managing ADHD symptoms, it's really about understanding it, thriving with it, and building systems that empower people. So today with us, we have Christal Wang. She's a visionary leader who took her personal experiences with ADHD and turned them into a mission to rethink how we support teens and adults navigating this journey. So together, we're going to talk about some of the gaps in ADHD support today and what coaching might offer as a new approach that may be something that each of us can do and help us think differently about ADHD. So, hi, Chris. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, Theresa. I'm so excited for this conversation. I think it's an important one to have opportunities and support that meets everyone where they're at. So I don't know if better is the right word, but an alternative, an addition to the support that exists.
And I like that. And the more options, the better, because as we talk about in the neurodiversity movement, we say things like, spiky profiles and different ways of being. And so there's not a one fix for everybody, but the more tools we have, the better. So one of the things our audience may not know about you, but I read is that your ADHD diagnosis was a bit of a turning point for you. So I would love for you to share your story, how we got here, and the moment that you realized that I don't just have ADHD, but this is going to reshape my life.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is hearing ADHD I call it coming out stories. I'm also queer, so I tend to use that word a lot in my life. But what I love about it is for a lot of people, it has been a turning point where as soon as they got diagnosed, they immediately, their whole life became wrapped around with ADHD. I mean, we were introduced through Trina, and Trina's story is a great example of that, where her entire career basically shifted because of it. And I would say I have a similar but different story. For me, I grew up actually as with the more typical male-leaning symptoms of hyperactivity, bouncing off of walls. I was that stereotypical small boy in class, getting kicked out of everything, constantly getting in trouble, having my own seat in the corner facing the wall. I had every little bit of it. And what's interesting, I think, about my story is that the reason I wasn't diagnosed, and even though I was bouncing off the walls, I never even considered ADHD, is actually because my cultural upbringing, because I'm Asian, and in Asian cultures, we don't talk about mental health. I know ADHD is not a mental illness, but kind of in that realm, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about anything that's related to emotions or related to neurodiversity as even further. So my diagnosis actually came when I was 28. And even after that diagnosis, I was at first very against medication. And again, because of my Asian upbringing, when I was younger, if I got sick, I wasn't allowed to take Tylenol because I would have to take these orange, bitter, natural medications that my grandma would make. So, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into a bit more when I think about about support gaps. Cultural competency, I think, is actually one of the biggest ones because it has shaped my personal experience of what it was like to grow up with ADHD, the people I compared myself with, the standards I set myself up with, and eventually even how I navigated my diagnosis and why I sought a behavioral solution to begin with. I think a lot of it was rooted in the fact that I was Asian, or I am Asian. So I think that's kind of been a big root or string through my journey that I think even to this day with Shimmer is a big part of what we try to make sure that we're able to meet other people where they're at, whether it's being Asian or any other sort of cultural competency.
I love how you're bringing in the concept of intersectionality, and we may segue here a bit. And so being that it wasn't something that you talked about, but you did at 28 go, something's up. What made you kind of break the cultural standard for you and to go that next step to go, do I have this? And can people help me?
Yeah, so I've actually heard that I've heard it's quite common, but I didn't know this, is during school, I had this very discrete goal. I had to get good grades. I had to get into this university. And there was always these boundaries around what was expected of me and what I could not mess up. And then after school, I immediately joined a very large consulting firm where there, again, were these very strict boundaries around, okay, this is what it looks like to be a level 1 consultant. This is what it looks like to be a level 2 consultant. And I realized that those things, although I was fighting against them all the time, was actually making sure that I was still performing. That structure that I hated so much was actually keeping me going. So when I left consulting because I didn't like the work, but I didn't know at the time, but the structure was keeping me in one piece. That was when everything then fell apart. I was in school. I was trying to start a business. There was a lot of things that were up in the air that didn't have these strict boundaries and rules. And that's when pretty much everything started falling into pieces. And I, at the time, didn't realize it was because I lost a lot of that structure. And I've heard so many similar stories from other folks in our community, a lot who are Asian, but other communities as well, who had the exact same experience where they were being held by these strict rules until a certain point when the rules disappeared. And then that was when they started questioning their ADHD diagnosis because all of the symptoms, not so much the symptoms, but the impairments were becoming stronger and stronger in their life to the point where they then sought a diagnosis, which is when I then sought a diagnosis.
And I like that structure conversation that you're bringing in. And I'm going to bring in some of our autism friends because sometimes people are like, how can you get to 13, 18 and not know these things? And one of the things I talk about often with that side of the house is that when we go to the earlier DSM-4, not 5, Asperger's often wasn't diagnosed till after the age of 13. And it's a similar pattern. That's when teachers kind of allow you to self-organize. You're like left alone to kind of make your friendships and dates. Your parents aren't micromanaging those relationships. And that's when we start to see the degradation in that like level 1 population and older. So I think it's a really interesting thing that you talk about, that the very structures an ADHD person drives us bonkers is also the very thing we need to make sure that we're meeting goals, staying on task. And when we don't have that, I think the good word is spin, or potentially leads to burnout because that ability, that executive functioning to like set your own goals and stay with them becomes much harder. So you reach out and you're like, things aren't working as well as they used to, right? So did you seek a therapist or a coach? Like what led you to, like, I know you received a diagnosis, but this also leads us to the alternate therapies we want to talk about today. So how did you land kind of where you are now?
I actually feel like my subpar experience with my diagnosis was the blessing in disguise that led me to discovering coaching, unfortunately. But basically, I got my diagnosis from a psychiatrist through my insurance. And when I got it, after many, many, many hoops, the first thing that she said was, here is 10 milligrams of Adderall, tell me in 2 weeks or 1 month, I can't remember the time, but tell me when you want to come back so that you can tell me if this dose is working or if you want more or less. And I was like, hold on. I don't know what my options are yet. I didn't say that I wanted this yet. And as I mentioned earlier, I was a little bit hesitant, and I guess I had some internalized stigma from my culture against medication at the time. And so I didn't want it. And I was floored that I was not given any other options. And when I asked for more options, I don't remember the exact thing she said, but the gist of it was just, do you want the Adderall or not? And so that really sent me on my rabbit hole. And I think every ADHD after the diagnosis has some sort of rabbit hole, but that sent me down my rabbit hole of, okay, what are the behavioral interventions that are out there and which ones of them might be a good fit for me? And so through that, I discovered therapy and I discovered coaching. And then through more rabbit holes, did a bunch of consultations and started figuring out that coaching was a better fit for what I was looking for at the time, based on me wanting more concrete strategies, action plans, potentially tools in my life, skills, and wanted to start there first before looking into therapy. And when I made that decision, that was when I went through this long journey of doing consultations, trying to figure out what a good coach was and which coach may be a good fit for me, what price point I wanted to pay. And it was just a huge overwhelm of a mess of me navigating that process. And it wasn't any one coach's fault, but the system that was sitting around coaches, I felt was pretty subpar. And so that's kind of what led me to what Shimmer is today.
And so let's tell folks, what is Shimmer?
We are a coaching platform, so we have now grown into a little bit more than that, but the original mission behind it, and what still is the mission, was to take a behavioral solution, ADHD coaching, and at first it was just to make it more affordable and more accessible. So we took technology, put it underpinned it, took some coaches that passed our initial bar and helped them get clients, and helped our clients be able to access sessions more easier with the right nudges, making sure that they got to the appointments, making sure they got the insights out of it. And then over time, we started discovering more challenges in the system. So one being that not all ADHD coaching is created equal, and not all credentials are created equal, and outcomes aren't tracked properly within the industry. And so that's when we started uncovering the quality piece. And so that's now become a second part of our mission. So now we design our own methodology. We're working with NYU on a randomized control trial to put more backing behind what we're doing. And so now it's evolved to a little bit more, but as a client, it is an ADHD coaching platform where you can come on, you do a series of questions where we'll match you with a coach that is best fit for you and also culturally competent. And then you'll meet each week with your coach and be able to also access our platform, which now includes a bunch of community, events like body doubling. And for example, this morning, I led a 2025 goal setting workshop so that folks could be able to set goals in ADHD friendly ways and not neurotypical ways. So just a variety of different events and community features that are baked into the system of what was traditionally ADHD coaching.
And what I like about what I'm hearing, and I like how your story brings folks on the journey, is in some ways, I'm looking at treatment, for the lack of a better word, as like a tripod. And I think that people who are new to any diagnosis in the neurodivergent spectrum do not realize that, and Chris's story highlighted very well, everyone, your psychiatrist is a medical doctor. Mm-hmm. So they are licensed and able to diagnose you with a medical condition, mm-hmm. for the lack of a better word, right? Yeah. And then, like most doctors, they look to come up with a treatment plan that is usually based on medication. You don't meet with them very often, mm-hmm. right? They really just want to meet to make sure that the medications are working without any adverse side effects. And so that is when they normally, and I'm sure this came up when you said, what more can I give you? And they said Adderall or not. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they'll say, well, if you want to talk things out, now you need to get a therapist. So there are many people, and for many of my listeners, I hope you're nodding as you go along. You have a doctor for your medication, and then you find a therapist. What's interesting about therapists is then they talk about, like you said, the behavioral aspects. And you lead that conversation. So if you're got stress or anxiety, or maybe you have cognitive distortions, or many different things that they can help with. They walk you through those things. But they are therapists, they're counselors. So what they don't do is, and I think this is where Chris was getting tripped up is, but how do I organize my day? Because a therapist by training isn't supposed to solve your problems. They're supposed to help you come to the conclusions of why you have your issues and give you tools. And so then you go to like life coaches, for the lack of a better word. Our ADHD coach is more like a life coach. And what I'm hearing Chris say is, much like life coaches, it's the Wild West out there, because you have some people that really do have some good methodologies, great pragmatic approaches, and are really helping people. And then other people who mean well, but maybe don't have a lot of structure. So I like that. That's my summary of Chris's journey and how she's kind of helping build a bridge. So when we think about coaching, what I'm hearing is it could really solve a lot of issues, like why am I having a hard time organizing my day? Why am I having a hard time at work? And it's less about diagnosing my differences because I have some sort of cognitive distortion. But coaching is to help come up with like a practical plan. Like, here is my obstacle, and we're going to build a plan or a timeline. Well, sorry, ADHD friends, we're not great at always being organized and almost having that accountability partner, which you said once you went off on your own, you lost, that kind of keeps you to task. So for someone who's listening and wondering, like, okay, would ADHD coaching help me? What are some signs that maybe coaching is the next step for you and not trying to find a new therapist?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that some of the biggest differences between coaching and therapy, one is that coaching is incredibly future oriented. It's about goal oriented progression towards the future that you would like to dream of. And so for some folks, I think the first layer is some folks are not ready for that yet. You're not in a space where you're ready to look 3-6 months into the future and set steps to go there, which is totally okay. And in those cases, you may need to go to a therapist first to get through that first step. And so I would say that's one, it's very future oriented. The second piece is action orientation. So are you at a place and is it your priority to change the systems in your life? And are you committed to putting in the work? It is also not easy, but putting in the work to change systems in your life. So that might be as simple as changing how you do to-do lists and calendars, or it may be more complex as to how do you identify triggers with impulsivity in your life with your partner, and then how do you communicate after you identify those triggers to be able to get to a better place. So there's so many realms of coaching that you can go into, but I would say the two biggest distinctions is the action orientation and the future orientation that I challenge folks to think about. And I would also say that like most modalities, none of this is mutually exclusive. Most of our coaching members also take medication. They also have therapists. Maybe right now they're coaching and they're not with their therapist, or vice versa. So it's really about finding what you need in this moment, and maybe for the next 3 months or 6 months. And because it might be a lot to do all of it all at once. And unfortunately for now, coaching is not currently insurance reimbursable. So sometimes it's also not financially feasible for folks to be able to do coaching all of the time as well. And so we're working on a few mechanisms there to try to make it more affordable for folks. But those are some things to consider if you're thinking through coaching versus therapy versus medication, or some combination of them.
And so I like that. Like, coaching involves a lot of actionable strategies. You mentioned that sometimes coaching is not affordable, or not affordable today, isn't necessarily covered by all insurance, although I'm sure there's some pathways that are opening up over time. But is there like one or two practical techniques where you're like, if you can't get into coaching today, what are some things that you could at least start setting your mindset that you should be prepared for if you should get a coach or if you wanted to try to self-help a bit?
Yeah, there are tons of things that you can start on. For one, I will say that we at Shimmer, we actually host free workshops and webinars almost every week now. Trina's actually the one running those, and she does an incredible job. So for example, we had one today and we have another one next week. And so you can find free resources like that all over the place. And also there's very low cost ones. For example, ADA, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, they hold support groups, and you can join those for $20 a month and get as many support groups as you want. So there's different tiers that can meet you where you're at if you aren't in a position to do coaching at the moment. And so I would say that finding those resources, and there's also far more free resources if you go online as well. Attitude is a really good one. Jessica McCabe's How to ADHD YouTube videos are awesome ones as well. And so a lot of free resources that are out there that allow you to start to have a bit of a lay of the land as to what things might work and not work for you. And so that you have a little bit of common language when you arrive at your ADHD coach as well. And I would say that if you want to start on the journey of self-coaching, the first, not in any particular order, but I would definitely look into goal setting. So thinking about what's important to you, what your values are, and what future you want to create. And I'm not even talking about like SMART goals, but really like intentions for yourself and how the life that you want to live. I think that's such an important piece of ADHD growth that is often overlooked because we're so focused on symptom management. And so I would say that's one. And the second one would definitely be to look into strengths. VIA is a great resource for doing a free strength finder exercise and finding out what your strengths are, because as we talked about, I know you talk about a lot too, like ADHD is not just symptoms, it's not just deficits, it really is everything. And so being able to focus on your strengths, I think, is something that is so valuable for people with ADHD and also so needed, because we beat ourselves up enough already. But if you can take your strengths, and for example, this morning in our workshop, we were talking about how after we set our goals, we said, okay, like now we'll take our strengths and figure out in these goals, is there any of your strengths that you can infuse into there that'll make it not only easier, but more fun for you to actually achieve those goals? So I think strengths would be another place that I would start if I was trying to self-coach myself.
And as you were talking about strengths, and you keep mentioning Trina Hayes. So for folks that don't know, we did a podcast with her a few episodes back. But one of the things that I always talk to folks, because especially women, but I would say anybody with ADHD, sometimes we're made to feel bad about things that we think are strengths. And so in the podcast with Trina, but I'll share it with folks here as well, like oftentimes we're told to focus on our strengths. And every once in a while, you will be in an environment, and it could be at school, it could be at work, it could be a relationship where you are made to feel bad or are criticized or even penalized because you execute on a strength in the wrong environment. And so I'll just pick on myself. I talk. I'm very candid, and I talk. And I talk a lot. And in the right environments, that's great. In the wrong environment, that has been problematic for me, where it's like you talk too long with the customers, you're holding up lines, right? So Trina had a similar story. So it's one of those things that we have to be really careful, because I often find, and this is what I would tell, so free coaching out there, guys, right now, what I would tell somebody with ADHD, that if somebody, I know that there's resistance to criticism in the ADHD world, but I actually would love to research and counter that notion, because I don't know if people with ADHD are actually resistant to criticism. I think what often happens is we are criticized for an area that we value or that is a strength, and we're just in the wrong environment. Because when it's actually happened to me, somebody told me I was too ethical. And so when you get a criticism that tells you that you're too ethical, which pretty much means that when you say you're going to do something, I hold you to it and I'm not overly flexible, which in some environments maybe isn't so great. Meaning if you say to me, Chris, I'm not going to eat sugar because I'm going to be healthy, I'm going to kind of call you out every time you start eating sugar. And maybe that's not necessary, right? So when you're laughing, how can you be too ethical? It's really just how rigid are you in terms of people upholding what they say they're going to do. But it's that whole idea of if somebody gives you feedback and it hurts, you might just be in the wrong place. And so what I think people with ADHD do is they're like, if you're told you're a chatty Cathy or you talk too much or you're too ethical, the first thing you do is you start to think about what is wrong with me. And rarely do we flip the script to say, oh, am I just a diamond in the wrong store? So I want to flip to kind of outside of what we've been talking about just for a moment, because a lot of the things you do, we are complements. You work with the individuals, but I'm often looking at the system and the organizations, which is why I went here. So when we zoom out, there are some larger gaps in the ADHD support system, right? Our cultures are barriers, our workplace cultures are barriers, education, even healthcare, right? Some supports are covered, other supports are not covered, depending on the insurance, the day, the week, right? So when you look at the big picture, because you're looking at trends, I know you are, where do you see are some like the largest gaps in the ADHD support system? So while you work with individuals trying to improve their ability to navigate the world, my other listeners who are looking at it from an org perspective and systems perspective, where do we need to meet you? Where do we need to start really chipping at the ice?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that just shows up everywhere is that most supports for people who have ADHD are based on the medical model. So it's going to be about symptom reduction. The things that people care about are about symptom reduction. And the conversation, I think, is in its works of shifting to the neurodiversity model, which means that the conversations are going to look really different, and that it is about neurodiversity. It is about making a space that is neuro inclusive for everyone. And that will also mean that there are people who are really smart, doing really well, who have ADHD, who need support, who are not going to be ascribing to or are not going to take the medical model as well in their day-to-day because it doesn't feel applicable to them. But those people still need support, and they are able to achieve so much more if we give them the right support. So I think it's about figuring out what is needed in the neurodiversity model that is equivalent to medication or therapy, things that are in the medical or in the medical model. And that needs to show up in the workplace. It needs to show up in schools, in families and homes. And it's not always going to be delivered by a healthcare provider. It might be delivered by a manager. It might be delivered by a parent. It might be delivered by a sister or a friend, to be able to create that space that actually is neuro-inclusive. So I think it's about widening the conversation beyond the medical model, which looks a little bit different depending on if it's workplace or home, but it's really bringing everyone into the fold, because you can help an individual as much as you want, but if they get to work and their manager is not helping them create the space or making them feel uncomfortable, or as you mentioned, kind of taking those strengths and making them feel like they're deficits to the individual, then no amount of medication or coaching is going to help them unless they leave and go to a different job. So I think it's really important for this conversation to be wider, the same way that women's rights is not just about women being in the conversation, but it's about men being in the conversation. I view that very similarly for not just ADHD, but neurodiversity as a whole.
So as we bring people along with us and we really want to help, like your mission is to help individuals and make coaching more accessible and giving people the tools they need. But I also want to help people think differently about ADHD and working with it and living with it, and not just as the person who may or may not have ADHD, but for the people that live and work with these folks. If there's one thing that we really need people to shift in perspective, and you like say, listeners, if you take one thing away from this conversation, what do you really want people? Like it's 2025. Where do we need them to be?
I think I would challenge people. If you're looking at a person who is neurodivergent, let's say a person with ADHD, you're a manager, you're a parent, is really about looking at how can this person is an asset to my team, to my family, and how do I help them get the most out of that? And it's part of my responsibility as well. And I think that shift in mindset of not saying, hey, this is a person with ADHD, what are all their deficits? And how do I need to make sure that I go closer and closer in on them until I can make sure that they're not making any mistakes? But instead, how do I help them get out of the situations where they might make mistakes and instead put them in the situations where they're actually going to be 10 times better than someone else who's neurotypical? Maybe it's the creativity, maybe it's risk-taking with entrepreneurship, whatever it is, help them put them in those situations so that we can change that exact phenomenon that you were talking about where you're seeing strengths and it's in the wrong spot, but instead helping them get to that right spot, because maybe for them, they've been hurt so many times in their life that they stop searching, that they stop putting themselves in a different spot. So it's really about that teamwork and shift of mindset so that we can all work together to get everyone in the right place, neurotypical or neurodivergent.
In 2020, 2021, they called it the Great Resignation. I didn't like that. And we're not talking about work, but I'm bringing it up because I feel like that was a moment of great reflection. And so I call it the Great Reflection because people started to reflect on what was working, which led to those resignations. But we also saw more people engaging with therapists, talking about mental health and wellness. And part of it was because they were trapped and maybe didn't have as much to do. But I also think that it was that moment of when you are forced to pause, you start to think about life. So here we are, we're like a week into 2025, we're there right now. And so people start to think about resolutions, what they want to change. And so I'm hoping that we get to folks that maybe aren't in the whole positive resolution and change. They just feel stuck. They got out of 2024, they're coming into 2025, and they're like, same as the last. Like every day is just the same as the last, and they're feeling stuck, or they might be feeling overwhelmed right now. What do we tell that person? Like, we're hopeful for the future, but they may not be yet. What do we say to them?
I think I've talked in different ways about the same thing many times, but I just feel so passionate about it. I think it's really about, for this person, it would be about strength-based reflection. So looking back at that last year and thinking through what went well. And what they'll probably say is nothing went well. 2024 was bad. And in that moment, it might not be that a specific action or a specific outcome went the way you were, that you wanted, but it might have been a specific attribute that showed up for you. Maybe you were brave in a moment that was hard. Maybe you brought love in a moment for a friend who was going through, or maybe your whole family was going through a lot of sadness, and you were able to inject some moment of love. So really looking for unconventional ways to find wins in your life, because there always is. And looking in ways that's more about just outcomes. I think we get really stuck on outcomes, on, did our, I don't know, financial situation go up? Did we get promoted? Did I get more fit? We're very stuck on these outcomes. And I think that the more we can think in terms of values and attributes and thinking about strengths in a slightly different way, then we can start to even plan 2025 better, to be potentially in 2025, you want to be more brave, more courageous. And that could look differently for each person, and bringing that in with a lot more inspiration and motivation than another year at the gym or another year at insert X outcome that you've been trying to get to all the time. So really bringing in that motivation by looking at things more holistically and more values-based.
I really like that. As you were talking, there were two things that came to mind, so I'm going to share with you. And hopefully they resonate. The first one that came to mind is the goal orientation of our society. And like, we're very achievement-based. And I know some folks with ADHD that were like, I have to do things that are important. I have to like be noteworthy. I have to like hit these pinnacles. And I was talking to one of them about, we need to be careful with that goal orientation, because if you think about climbing Mount Everest, while it's a huge achievement, you literally only spend like 5 seconds at the top, because if you stay there too long, you will die. And so it's like, we're this like goal-oriented achievement society, but for people who haven't won the big award or something, as cool as it looks like when they win that Oscar, right? They just had the Golden Globes yesterday or something. That is like literally a 5-minute moment in time. And after the moment happens, it's like gone. And I don't think people always realize that. So it's like making sure that you're finding the strengths and the joy in the journey, because the pinnacle is fleeting. But the other thing that I was thinking about is, and sometimes it comes and goes so fast, so I got to find it. It is, I don't know if people are always valuing the moments. And so it's like you said, did you make somebody feel love? And I think that's just like this really huge thing that I think sometimes we lose. Oh, I remembered it. I knew it would come if I kept talking. And so one of the things somebody said is we are in this social media craze, right? Where people like share a picture and they're sad if they don't get 1,000 likes. But what somebody's post said the other day, and I think we all need to hear it, is that like if you were in a room and 20 people complimented you, that would be huge. So maybe those 20 likes mean like we need to really reset that like we have a global audience, but whether it's 1 like or 1,000 likes, that's an individual recognizing you. And I think we need to like take a step back and think about what that actually means. And maybe the volume isn't as sexy as we think. So these sessions always go longer or speed by, and they feel longer. I feel like you've given people so much information, and I love that you're developing this new tool and you've talked us through things, but just, as we wrap up today, help people find you. Where can they learn more about Shimmer and the services you're providing?
Yeah, you can find us on www.shimmer.care. And I actually recently, you talking about likes and stuff, so that really hit home for me because I recently started posting on my socials as well around hacks and strategies and skills and things like that I've been learning from coaching. So you can also find me on Instagram where I'll be looking for your likes at ADHD.Christal. So ADHD.CHRISTAL as well. But yeah, thank you so much for holding the space, for all the work that you do. I had a great time. I have lots of thoughts from everything you've shared as well. I think especially what you said about the pinnacle is fleeting. I cannot second that as much. We really need to, as a society, learn to, and individuals, learn to love every step that we're taking because the steps are the only thing that are real and consistent. The goal might change, it might disappear. We don't know if we have tomorrow. So really just falling in love with the steps and the processes that we have in our lives.
Making every moment count, I think is what they say. I really enjoyed our conversation too. I look forward to more, and I really look forward to seeing how, this third branch of care can grow so that more people can find the tools they need. I just want to thank you so much for your time and being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Works Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.